Hello and welcome to Pronouns 101, a common learning experience for OU faculty and staff. My name is Blake Anthony Ilan. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I am the coordinator for the Gender and Sexuality Center here at Oakland. And I'm excited to be your facilitator for this module on this topic that is so important to me in my work and also to me as an individual. This module will contain 4 sections. The first will be discussing why this matters, why we're having this conversation in the first place, and why OU has chosen to make this the fall common learning experience. Second, we'll talk about pronouns, including teaching you how to use a variety of pronouns, including gender-neutral pronouns, some of which you might not have heard before. Third, we'll discuss some guidance, some ways for you to ask for pronouns, how to talk about pronouns, and how to help others learn. Lastly, we'll provide some recommendations for how you can continue to practice and learn, and how you can support OU students, faculty, and staff through your allyship with simple actions you can take to make our campus a more inclusive place. In the first section of this module, we'll talk about why this topic matters, why it's important for us to care about this topic, who this conversation most impacts, and what social issues does this training address. When asked why this is an important conversation for the OU community, the first thing that comes to mind is OU's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. You'll see our DEI statement listed on the screen here. Diversity, equity, and inclusion in practice includes a commitment to learning about and actively supporting the LGBTQ+ community. We know that one of the most frequent issues faced by our campus LGBTQ+ community is misgendering, which is generally caused by a lack of education rather than malice. Our goal for this training is to increase your knowledge about pronouns so you're better able to support and affirm all members of our OU community. The first thing I want to mention as we get started is that pronouns aren't new and aren't specific to transgender and non-binary people. So pronouns are just a part of language, like nouns, adjectives, and verbs. They're something that you may have learned about in an English class, but conversations around pronouns and their importance are most often brought up by or in reference to transgender and non-binary people. And as we move through this, we'll talk about some of the reasons why that may be the case. And before I give you that answer, here is your first moment where we encourage you to pause and reflect and to ask yourself this question: why might pronouns be especially important to transgender, non-binary, and gender non-conforming people? So if you have some paper in front of you, we would love for you to take down some notes. It's okay for you to be wrong, but this is a good point for you to think through this question and to figure out where your knowledge gaps may be, where some of your biases may be, and to begin the practice of reflecting on these questions as we move through this module. There are lots of reasons why this is a particularly salient conversation for trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming people. The first of which being that misgendering tends to happen to us more often than it does to cisgender folks. It's not exclusively our experience, but it is something that we tend to be facing relatively chronically in our daily lives. We're also constantly thinking about our gender and really hoping that this doesn't happen. Our gender is something that is on our mind so much of the time, in the way that we present ourselves and the way that we're being perceived. And so this is something that we are just actively thinking about very often. And because of that, we're likely to be carrying around a lot of pain and anxiety around our gender expression and around the ways that we are frequently misgendered. But a key here is that while this is something that can happen to anyone, when it happens to trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming people, sometimes it is very much an intentional act. Misgendering and using the wrong pronouns is something that is done to trans, non-binary people, often on purpose, as a means to dehumanize us, to hurt us, or to imply that our gender is not real. While it's more common for trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming people to be misgendered, it happens to cisgender people too. An example I often give is my mom. My mom has short hair, is tall, and is often confused for being a man when people see her from behind. She'll be in line at the supermarket, people will say, "Excuse me, sir," and it makes her really upset. This happens all the time. The difference being, usually when it happens to cisgender people, cisgender just being the word for people who are not trans and non-binary, it's usually a mistake. People generally correct themselves immediately. People understand relatively quickly what that correction should be, and they're able to implement it. With trans and non-binary folks, this tends to be more complicated. People tend to not realize they've made a mistake, or once they realize they've made a mistake, aren't sure what to do. And that's what we'll discuss throughout this training. In English and many other languages, pronouns are sometimes used to communicate the gender or genders of the subjects that we're discussing. So because of this, most people are comfortable being referred to with specific pronouns and not comfortable being referred to with others. Using my mom as an example again, if people say, "Oh yeah, he's right in front of me," that would make her uncomfortable. For myself, if someone says, "Oh yes, she's the coordinator for the Gender and Sexuality Center," that makes me uncomfortable. This may not have been something that you've ever thought of, especially if it's never happened to you, but it happens significantly more often than people realize. We want you to be as comfortable with this conversation as possible. We know nobody enjoys making mistakes or feeling uncomfortable. Talking about and displaying pronouns openly helps everyone. An example that you may not have thought of is gender-neutral names. Have you ever seen someone make a huge email flub and refer to somebody with the wrong title, so Mr. instead of Mrs., or the opposite, or use the wrong pronouns for someone because they weren't sure what that person's gender was because of their name? Maybe it's a name that they're not familiar with, a name that's not common in the English language. This is another reason why displaying pronouns openly helps everyone. If you know someone's pronouns, this will make your life easier too. You don't have to guess, make assumptions, or question if you insulted someone if you know how to refer to them. So that's our goal, is to help you have the tools to be able to know how to refer to folks, to ask for pronouns, and to not make as many mistakes, to not fear making as many mistakes, because you have the toolkit to avoid those mistakes and to recover when those mistakes do inevitably happen. In the next section of this module, we're going to talk through the use of a variety of different sets of pronouns, some that you're more likely to be familiar with, and others that, even to folks who have received education on this topic in the past, are relatively likely to be new to you, or at least newer to you. And so we hope that you take the time to engage in this practice. So this first and second set of pronouns that we're going to talk about are the ones that you're most likely to be familiar with, the two that are most commonly used in the English language. But I want to walk through them anyways, just to kind of model how we're going to talk through the remaining pronouns that we have in this module, and just so you can kind of see what the structure of these slides is going to be. Additionally, we want to be mindful of folks for whom English may not be their first language, and to not assume knowledge of how these grammatical structures work. It is helpful to hear me explain these in the same way that I'm going to explain the others, because in some cases there are similarities between these pronouns and ones that we'll talk about later. So using he, him, his is our first example. Mick is a remarkable student who spends a lot of time volunteering in his community. You can often find him hanging out in the GSC with his friends. Sometimes he finds himself spending hours playing The Sims and losing track of time. So we can see here in our chart, we got the pronouns he, him, his. The nominative is he, objective is him, possessive determiner is his, possessive pronoun is also his. And this is an area where, as we move through, some of these are not going to match in the same way that this one does. And reflective, himself. So as I mentioned in the last slide, the possessive determiner and possessive pronoun aren't always the same. And so she, her, hers is an example of this, where we say that's her backpack and that backpack is hers, versus that's his backpack, that backpack is his. And so you'll see this structure as we move throughout some other pronoun options as well. Just as a refresher, using she, her, hers, Mo is a student athlete who loves spending her free time with her teammates. It's rare to see her by herself. She has memory loss, so if you see a purple backpack laying around here, it's probably hers. And she, her, her in particular is going to be an especially helpful place to return to for reference as we move through some of the pronouns we're going to talk about later. While he, him, his, and she, her, hers are the pronouns that we tend to be most comfortable with, they, them, theirs has been used since at least the 13th century. Since around then, the English language has had a way to refer to an individual who's gender we don't know, and we're still only talking about one person when we do this. So examples of this are someone parked their car in front of my driveway. We wouldn't say someone parked his car or someone parked her car. We would say someone parked their car. Or I need a new dentist and I need them to be more gentle than my last dentist. Or we have a new mail carrier and they keep bringing us the neighbor's mail. An example I use often is if someone left a cell phone in my office, I would take it to the lost and found and say, hey, someone left their phone in my office. I wouldn't say someone left his phone, someone left her phone. I'd say someone left their phone. So when we use singular they pronouns for somebody who uses those pronouns, we're just doing the same thing. While they has been used to refer to one person since as early as the 13th century, some people will point to the grammar that's used around the word they to imply that it should only be used as a plural. But they isn't the only singular pronoun that in English uses what we would consider to be plural grammar. You does as well. We would say, the new mail carrier hasn't come yet, they are running late. We would also say, you haven't left the house yet, you are going to be so late. They are, you are. We're talking about one person, and we're using what we would call plural grammar. So while in English we also do use they to talk about multiple people, this doesn't detract from the importance of or common usage of the singular pronouns they. There have been some times in educational history where it was taught that to avoid confusion, the singular neutral pronoun should be he or he/she, and we tend to not use these options anymore, and they aren't considered inclusive language. So as you may have guessed, the reason we don't use he as the neutral is that it contributes to sexism. It posits men or people who use he, him, his pronouns as the default, and it can also just be logistically confusing to use he as a neutral. We also don't use he/she as often anymore, though you will see this sometimes in documents, because he, she, pronounced as such, is a slur against transgender people, and so sometimes he/she gets read as that. Additionally, any place where you could use he/she in a document, you could replace it with a singular they, and there would be no change to the meaning of that document. So one of our recommendations is to replace he/she with they, and through context, it's generally clear that we're talking about one person. Based on everything we've just learned, we can begin to understand how to use they, them, theirs pronouns for an individual person. I'm going to read these examples and go through this chart with you to make sure that you understand how to use these pronouns. Chi-Chi worked for the GSC. They are one of our peer mentors. Their mentees tell us that they are a great listener. They fancy themselves a particularly good writer, and we agree. They despise the color yellow, so if you see anything yellow, it's definitely not theirs. You'll probably see them wearing all black more often than not. One thing that I want to mention here, if you look at this chart in the reflexive tense, there are two options for what you can use. We might say they fancied themselves a particularly good writer, or they fancied themselves a particularly good writer. Either one of those is considered appropriate and grammatically correct. I'm often asked, what does it mean in terms of identity when someone uses they, them, theirs pronouns? Gender-neutral pronouns such as they, them, theirs can be used by people with any gender identity, but are most commonly used by non-binary people. Non-binary people identify as not men and not women, as something in between or outside of that binary. Gender is not a binary system, and it's unique to each individual. As we continue to learn about pronouns that may be newer to you, keep in mind that for those who use them, they are genuinely the way they feel most comfortable being referred to. This doesn't necessarily tell us exactly how they identify. It tells us the most important piece of information, how they should be referred to. So to summarize that, pronouns do not necessarily equal identity, that we can't know exactly how someone identifies in terms of what words they use for their gender based on the pronouns that they use. What it tells us is how they're comfortable being referred to, and that's likely going to be related to their gender, but not always in ways that we can clearly understand without asking further questions, which are likely not our business. While they, them, theirs are the most commonly used gender-neutral pronouns, there are plenty of others that you may encounter. The reason these are the most commonly used is because this is a word that already exists in the English language that people are familiar with, that we can use tools like saying, hey, this is the same thing that you do when you don't know someone's gender, people can understand and implement that relatively easily. But there are also newer pronouns that are called neopronouns. Neo just means new. And I'm going to give an overview of the 3 versions of neopronouns that I hear most from OU students. There are tons of additional options, and we'll talk more about what to do if you are presented with pronouns that are not these next 3 that you're not comfortable with or familiar with, so that you can learn how to use those as well. The first set of neopronouns we're going to teach is am-ers. Am-ers, the trick that I always like to tell people, are just they, them, theirs without the th. So the grammar is going to be the same as they, them, theirs. So once you get a hold on they, them, theirs, you can transition into using am-ers for folks who assert those pronouns as well, and just keeping that they, them, theirs trick in mind. So to use these as an example, Latrice is a sophomore. A are an orientation assistant. Our OGL word was determination. A recently bought herself a new car, so if you see a bright blue Jeep around campus, it's probably Airs. You'll probably hear M blasting K-pop before you even see our car coming. Of note, some people who use am-ers might use singular grammar, so A is instead of AR, but AR tends to be more common, in part so that people can say it's the same thing as they, them, theirs, but without the th. So you'll tend to see what we would consider plural grammar used for am-ers as well. But if somebody you know uses am-ers and uses A is instead of AR, just follow our lead. The next is Z here, here's. And fun fact about Z here, here's pronouns is that they have historically actually been equally, if not more common at times as a singular pronoun than they, them, theirs in terms of their use in non-binary communities in particular. But something that we've seen over time is folks gravitating more towards they, them, theirs because they are able to more easily explain those to people and rather than teaching them new words, essentially. But Z here, here's pronouns have been around for solidly more than a decade, probably closer to 20 years, if not more. And so these are ones that you'll hear relatively commonly, and maybe most likely of these to see in literature. So use these as an example. Katya loves gardening. Her kitchen is full of plants. Z recently found herself with too many plants and had to give some away. The basil plant in the GSC was hers before Z brought it in. I have to remember to ask here how often to water it. And so the trick for this is that the grammar is the same as she, her, hers. So I had mentioned using she, her, hers as a point of reference for some of these. If you're finding yourself stuck in using Z here, here's one tool that some folks find helpful is writing things out in she, her, hers, and then translating them over to Z here, here's. I do say to have some caution in doing that, as you don't want to then accidentally be using she, her, hers for this person. But if you find it helpful in practicing the grammar, then that is certainly a tool that you can use. And lastly, we have Z, zers, zers. And these function the same as Z here, here's, but using Z's in place of the H's, so zir instead of here. So as an example, Ben loves drawing. Zir favorite thing to draw is animals. Z recently enrolled Zirself in a digital illustration class. The sketchbook that's usually on the GSC desk is Zir's. I commissioned Zir to draw a portrait of my dog. And so some folks, Z, Zir, Zir's just feels more comfortable and is more accessible versus the here's. And for other folks, Z here, here's is simpler to learn first, but they are most easy in my experience to learn in reference to each other. So once you get the hang of one, it's relatively easy to get the hang of the other. And here is another moment for you to pause and reflect and to be vulnerable enough to be honest with yourself. So how does learning about these pronouns make you feel? It's okay to experience confusion or frustration in this moment, but it's important to ask yourself, how will you continue to work through those feelings? Also of note, it is certainly also uncomfortable when you are an individual for whom these are the only pronouns that feel comfortable to have referred to you, and to very often not have this be the way people are referring to you. It is uncomfortable to constantly be having to teach people how to use your own pronouns. It is uncomfortable to constantly be argued with about whether your pronouns are valid or not. And so we do know that there are some confusion and frustration that can come in these moments, even feelings of disbelief that this is important or real. And we just encourage you to work through those and to find ways to circle back to our mission of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the importance of doing the work to actively support the LGBTQ plus community. And this is one of those ways that doing the work is really impactful on your relationships with your students and colleagues. In part 3 of this module, I'm going to provide you with some guidance, including how to navigate conversations about pronouns, asking for pronouns, and ways to be a supportive force in this conversation. So building up your toolkit as you navigate this topic in the real world. So a question that's come up in trainings recently has been, why do folks list their pronouns with multiple versions of that pronoun? So he/him, or they/them/theirs. Why not just say he or they? And listing multiple forms of the pronoun does help make it clear that it is a set of pronouns being listed, rather than those pronouns being used as part of a phrase. And so this is particularly helpful when folks have one set of pronouns that they're most comfortable with, and we'll talk about multiple pronouns in just a moment. But if you were to write Blake, he, coordinator, the he in that looks like it's the beginning of a phrase or a typo. But if you wrote Blake, he, him, coordinator, it's very clear that I am indicating that my pronouns are he, him. And so this is why you'll generally see when someone uses one set of pronouns, listing 2 or 3 versions of that pronoun to make it clear that they are talking about pronouns. And when folks use multiple pronouns, you will generally see these listed in one of 2 ways, what I call the combined format or as separate sets. So combined for someone who uses both he, him, and they, them pronouns would be he/they. The separate sets format would be he, him, comma, they, them. And so the combined version works here because we have more than one pronoun used and listed with a slash in between. So it still has that format that makes it clear that we're talking about someone's pronouns and not beginning a phrase. And this is another reason why he/she is not particularly helpful as a neutral option over singular they, because it kind of implies that we're talking about a person who uses he or she pronouns. You may also see folks indicate more than 2 pronouns or say something like any pronouns. And of note, since we talked about z, zir, and z here, you're more likely to see folks who use those pronouns list separate sets just so that they have the opportunity to make it clear whether they use the zir or the here version. But if you see someone list something like they/z, feel free to ask them if they use zir or here. That is a totally valid and helpful question for both of you. It is relatively common for folks to have more than one set of pronouns they're comfortable having used to refer to them. And so I'm often asked what to do in this situation, which people should use, how they navigate multiple pronouns. And so here is my guidance for that. My biggest suggestion, especially for those of us who are in positions of power, we may have some influence, or where we're doing documentation of any kind, is I find it really useful to ask the person if they have a preference for which you use. And so if someone says, I use he, they pronouns, my question is going to be, great, thank you for telling me. Do you have a preference for which I use? Or do you have a preference for which I put in your advising note? Oftentimes people will list pronouns in order of preference, but not always. And so I've seen guidance that says just use whatever they list first. I find it more helpful to ask if they have a preference for which you use. And there's lots of reasons why the answer they give you might be different from the answer that they give someone else. So you asking this question may be the reason they feel comfortable sharing which of those is their primary preference. They may also want to make sure that documentation stays in one set of pronouns just in case it gets released some way to parents. Even if this is an unrealistic fear, stuff that is protected by FERPA or protected legally. That anxiety still exists, and so helping folks navigate that is always going to be helpful. And additionally, there may be other contextual reasons why they have a preference for what you use that might not be the same every day, might not be the same in all spaces. So you're providing an opportunity for folks to give you any of that context that's going to be helpful. Whether they give you a preference or tell you, I don't have a preference, you can use whatever you like of this set, do what they ask. You also may be asked to alternate or use different pronouns in different situations. So, for example, hey, can you use he, him while I'm at work? But when my parents are around, the only ones that are safe to use are she, her. Alternating would look something like someone using he, they pronouns and saying, yep, he came to work today, but they were running late. And he mentioned that his grandparent was in the hospital and that they would be possibly leaving early to go be with family. So I used both sets of pronouns for that person in one sentence. Additionally, it's super important to remember not to be judgmental or disrespectful when folks share that they use multiple pronouns. It is relatively common for us to hear folks say that this is not something that's valid. And some examples of disrespectful comments would be saying something like, well, if you're giving me the option of they or Z, I'm obviously going to use they because Z is too hard. Likely that person could be providing you those two options because that tends to be the response they get to Z. Maybe that's what they really, really want to be using, but they know that in their life, folks have been really resistant towards that. And we don't want to add another person who's being resistant to some of their pronouns to their plate. Another example is, I'm going to stick with he since you look like a he. This could be someone who gave you he, they pronouns. This could be someone who gave you pronouns that didn't even include he. But questioning someone's pronouns or connecting pronouns to appearance in unnecessary ways is generally disrespectful. We often hear folks who use multiple pronouns being asked to just pick one, and they know themselves better than you know them. So they absolutely have reasons why they're providing you with multiple options. And asking questions like if they have a preference for what you use can help you to better understand why they're giving you more than one option. But for a lot of folks, they just genuinely are comfortable with more than one option being used. And another disrespectful comment we often hear is for folks who identify as a woman who use more than one set of pronouns. So, for example, she, they. This implication that identity and pronouns have to be connected in ways that you understand. So why would you even use those pronouns if you identify as a woman? This is not helpful. You saying any of these things is not going to help someone to better understand themselves, and it's not really helping you better understand them either, and certainly not build rapport with them. And so you may hear these things in your mind, just being mindful of not letting any judgment you have be reflected in how you actually talk to this person. And if you have questions about how to use these pronouns or why someone would use these pronouns, you're more than welcome to get a hold of the Gender and Sexuality Center. And we're certainly happy to help you out. It is not helpful to put that burden onto the person who has just shared with you. So, of course, we have to talk about how to ask for pronouns. And we often hear, well, isn't it offensive to ask as if it's not, and imply that it's not obvious? Whereas what's most helpful is if we normalize asking, it does help us to better understand that it isn't always obvious, and helps destigmatize the asking in situations where it is incredibly helpful to ask. And so the easiest way to ask for pronouns is to give yours first. And so I might say, hi, I'm Blake. I use he, him, his pronouns. How about yourself? Or if I forgot to do that the first time I met someone, hey, I forgot to ask last week, but I use he, him, his pronouns. What are your pronouns? It can be helpful to check back in with folks, particularly if you notice a change or a reaction to the use of pronouns that you've just used. To say, hey, Gus, good to see you again. Quick question before I start writing my notes. Are you still using he, him, his pronouns? And additionally, it's important to not push folks too hard if they ignore the question. And there's lots of reasons why this may happen. There are certainly cases where folks may be uncomfortable with the question because they don't understand it or because they feel like it may be obvious. Generally, those people will tell you something to that effect. And if folks are not answering, it is often because they have reason to not disclose to you at this time. They may be weighing the options in their mind at that moment of, do I essentially lie to this person or do the thing that's going to keep me safe? And so people will often just choose to pretend they didn't hear the question. It can be helpful to use they, them, or their name until or unless you know their pronouns. I mentioned on the last slide using people's names in place of pronouns, and just want to show you what I mean. So for an example, if somebody, we don't know their pronouns, or they specifically say, I actually choose not to use pronouns, I ask people to use my name instead, this is how we would do that. So for Bob, we would say, Bob is graduating this semester, Bob's major is social work, and Bob's minor is communication. When Bob was a first-year student, Bob wrote a letter to Bob that Bob's COM 1100 instructor will be mailing out soon. So even as I say this now, and as somebody who's been doing this work for over a decade, by the time I say Bob for the 5th or 6th time, I'm always tempted to switch into using a pronoun, whether that be he or they or she or z or something else. And so this also demonstrates why we have pronouns in our language, that it sounds redundant to be using this person's name over and over again. This is still what we do if it's the only option we have, if this is what somebody asks for. This is also why people tend to have pronouns that they use. It's because this can begin to sound redundant. So I mentioned there being lots of reasons for people not being comfortable disclosing their pronouns when asked, and this can be particularly challenging when in larger groups of people. So when I'm working with a class or with a larger group of students, one thing that is always an option is to ask for pronouns in a private form. So rather than asking folks to go around and share their pronouns with the group, if this is a group that I'm going to see from week to week more than once, I could also send them something like a Google form, asking them to disclose their pronouns to you, and maybe any conditions that might impact their pronoun use in your space. So this gives someone the opportunity to say, I want you to use she, her in class, but I actually use they, them. I'm just not ready for everyone in this class to know that. Maybe someone in that class is their cousin or their sibling. Find this to be an inclusive way to get this information, to give people opportunities to give context without putting pressure on folks in the moment to disclose their pronouns to the entire group. There are plenty of other pronouns besides the ones that we have talked about today, and so if someone provides you with pronouns that you aren't familiar with, my biggest tip is to ask them how to spell them. This will allow you to effectively look them up later or immediately, just like swiftly pull up your phone, do a little Google. This moment, do your best, accept and apply corrections, go home, research, and practice. But you having that accurate spelling will then take you to tools that will allow you to learn about those pronouns. If you're not spelling them correctly, it's just going to be much more difficult for you to find resources about those pronouns. So we mentioned one of the goals of this module being you being someone who could help create positive change around this conversation, and being able to navigate these uncomfortable comments is a huge part of that. So something that we hear, unfortunately, relatively often is when presented with this topic, folks just say, I don't believe in pronouns. And they typically don't mean this in the way that it sounds. This is generally a way of folks intentionally or unintentionally sharing that they don't believe that this is an important conversation or that they should have to be mindful of other people's pronouns, that pronouns should be or are obvious for everyone. And so ways that I will often respond to this is, do you mean for yourself or other people? In theory, they could be saying that they don't use any pronouns for themselves. They want you to just use their name. It's usually not what they mean. And so I'll then often say, well, pronouns are just a part of speech. You use mine all the time. So if you're confused about For example, Katya's pronouns, I can help you practice Z here. Another response that we hear is, well, my pronouns are obvious. Why would you ask me that? A response to this could be something like, I don't mean to offend you. We ask everyone because sometimes pronouns seem obvious, but they aren't for everyone. I take it that means you use she, her, and then we're just basing things off of appearance. And then lastly, we sometimes hear, well, you're either a he or a she. And a response to this would be, you're welcome to use those pronouns if they work for you, but it's also completely valid to not be comfortable being referred to as he or she. Using gender-neutral pronouns for someone else doesn't take anything away from you. Rather, it makes our community more inclusive. So it's helpful. You're setting the line. You're saying, I understand that this is where you stand. This is not where we're going to stand as a community. And that this personal belief is not a reason for us to not honor the pronouns used by our student or our colleague. And you're setting an example in your space, which is critically important. This is our final slide where we ask you to pause and reflect. And so we know that more often than not, when members of our community question the importance or validity of pronouns, it's due to lack of awareness or education. And we recommend offering guidance and education in these moments. So the question for you to reflect on as we move forward is, do you feel after this module, do you feel compared to offer that guidance and education? What else might you need to get there? And we're about to talk about some resources to hopefully help you cross that finish line if you are still not quite feeling comfortable with this conversation or in your ability to help provide guidance and education to others. In this fourth and final section of the module, we're going to talk about ways that you can practice using a variety of pronouns and how to be active in your allyship. There's a worksheet and resources that are available through eSpace, and we're going to walk through some other options for you to continue to learn as well. We recommend that you go into the eSpace and find the worksheet called Pronouns Practice. This worksheet will allow you to practice using the pronouns that we have discussed throughout this presentation. An answer key is available on the second page of that document. If you have any questions about the worksheet, don't hesitate to reach out to me for assistance. My extension is 4333, and my email is blakebonkowski@oakland.edu. Or you can come see me in 104J North Foundation Hall during business hours. Appointments are not required, but are recommended if you just want to make sure that I'm not in another meeting or something. And Google Calendar is a great way to schedule time with me. One of the most important ways that you can help be a supportive ally to folks for whom this is a more salient conversation is to normalize giving rather than assuming pronouns. And having your pronouns listed in your email signature, syllabus, etc. allows people whose pronouns are often forgotten, ignored, or misassumed to not be the only ones stating their pronouns. So if trans and non-binary people were the only ones to indicate their pronouns, we would essentially be outing ourselves by listing our pronouns. Other people who get misgendered, such as gender nonconforming folks or folks with neutral or ambiguous names, would still get misgendered. And we reinforce the idea that pronouns can or should be assumed or obvious. So this is a really powerful way for you to help normalize this conversation in a way that is really, really helpful for trans, non-binary, gender nonconforming folks and others in our community. So I want to give you some examples of ways that you could include your pronouns in your email signature. I've got an example here with Carry a Card where we have the pronouns listed next to the name. We also have an example here with Grizzly O'Bear where the pronouns are listed underneath the name. And I also provided my email signature to you. So there's a couple features in here that I think may be helpful for you to see. And so in my email signature, you'll see that there are 3 links here. Over my first name, it's how to pronounce my first name. Over my last name, it's how to pronounce my last name. Those are, particularly with my last name, it's a question I get often. And even if it wasn't, like it isn't with my first name, it's another element of normalizing saying and understanding how to pronounce people's names. That I think is a kindness we can do towards our community. And then I have my pronouns listed, and those are a link as well. And those take you to a website called pronouns.org, which explains how to use those pronouns as well as the importance of pronouns. So while I use he, him, his, those aren't necessarily ones that people tend to have challenges with. It's still linking folks to a helpful resource, which I think is a great step that you can take in normalizing this conversation, even if your pronouns are not something that is generally seen as up for debate or confusing to others. Similar to how we are normalizing including the pronouns, normalizing putting this link in, I think, is a really great additional step that you can take as well. There are a variety of resources that we've provided here for you to continue to learn. One is How to They, Them, a visual guide to non-binary pronouns in the world of gender fluidity. We'll hopefully be doing some programming around this book and with this author in the winter 2024 semester, so be on the lookout for that. There's some other books listed here as well. All of these books are available for you to check out from the Gender and Sexuality Center's lending library. Just visit our office and we'll help you out with that. Additionally, here are some websites that we find helpful. I just mentioned pronouns.org. And then these websites can be helpful for practicing or for listing pronouns in an email signature as well. Each of these practicing pronouns websites is going to have different sets of options. And so this is where that knowing how pronouns are spelled can come in handy. If you're Googling a specific set, you'll get some version of a website like practicewithpronouns.com that includes the pronouns that you are looking for. And lastly, we have prepared a folder of resources in PDF format that you can utilize in the Gender and Sexuality Center's virtual resource library. This QR code will take you there. You can also get to our resource library from our link tree or our website, which are both listed off to the right here. Additionally, this training is available in-person or virtual format to any OU department or student group who would like to collectively get this knowledge and to schedule a training. You can just reach out to the Gender and Sexuality Center, and we are more than happy to schedule with you. Thank you again for taking the time to participate in this common learning experience, and thank you for committing to your learning about this important topic and the LGBTQ+ community.